Good morning. I'm Miranda Lennox, pronouns they, them, theirs, and today is my last Sunday as intern minister of this congregation. It's traditional for intern ministers like me to close out our internship period by sharing some lessons which we hope the congregation will carry forward. And as a big believer in the interconnected continuum of learning, I want to give you back a lesson that I've learned from working here with you. The incredibly short form of that lesson is that willingness is a pillar of love. But when I was planning this service and shared that phrase with others, the unanimous response that I got was, huh? So it's a good thing that I get an entire sermon to explain myself. Establishing what I mean by willingness, much less what it's got to do with love, is going to take a little storytelling. I remember back in grade school when they taught us geography. My teachers tried to have us memorize the US states so that we could fill them in on a map. I was completely hopeless at it. It felt so abstract. All of the state shapes just looked like these jagged blobs to me, and I could never locate more than maybe 15 of them. In fact, a mere 5 years ago, I couldn't have been certain of identifying any of the lower 48 aside from California, Texas, and the places where I had already lived. Then, 3 years ago, I started seminary. In our first week of classes, we talked about how important it is to the healing of our ecological crisis that we all create a deep emotional relationship with the land that we live on. We also talked about how important it was to begin addressing colonialism by learning about the indigenous American tribes which lived and continue to live in our own region. By the end of that week, I got in the car and drove from my former home in Boston to my new home in Oakland. This became a really special opportunity for me. We took the southern route and camped in national parks along in each state. Each time I took a shift in the passenger seat, my curiosity would drive me to pull up some articles on my phone and start learning. I would read aloud as I found information about each city and state we passed through, how it developed, who lives there now and why, which indigenous people belonged there, what happened to them. The plants and animals which surrounded us, I made a real emotional connection, the small beginnings of a real understanding. And when I arrived in the Bay, I realized that I knew geography. I could label every southern state on a map. I could see their major cities in my mind and bring forth the colors and the smells of the landscape. It was no longer an abstract, something that I should know because someone else said that it was important. I felt the importance of knowing how different each of these places could be. And that was how I came to this congregation, at the end of one kind of learning journey and the very beginning of another. You see, I had applied to seminary with the absolutely baseless conviction that I was exempt from racism. I wanted to change white supremacy in the world, but deep down, I didn't think that I needed to change myself. I even knew that I was supposed to acknowledge white supremacy's impact on my existence, but I thought that making the right choices was enough. Vote the right way. Stand up to people saying and doing racist things. Slavery is bad. Check, check, check. My conscience was clear. Or so I thought. Seminary ended up being exactly the right place to administer a much needed reality check, but I needed to get it under my skin, in more than one sense of that phrase. I am not going to tell you how that learning happened for me, because one of the core problems is that those of us in dominant cultural groups want a step-by-step how-to path to follow, which will bring us to our own absolution, and the change that does have to happen, and happen again, and keep on happening, is something that is deeply personal and different for everyone. But I will tell you that one morning I woke up, I stood up alone in my room, and then I fell down on my knees, and I cried what felt like hundreds of years worth of tears. Something had become real for me and personal. Atrocities were happening to my family, from within my beloved family, and I was a part of that abuse. I haven't talked about this publicly until now, even though that first moment of true connection struck me over 2 years ago. In the first place, it's hard to describe it without sounding like I'm talking about that we're all one human family idea, which has led to so much spiritual bypassing and abdication of real responsibility. For another thing, I felt like it was skipping a step. I've been trying to use my personal experiences as a teacher for how to behave, and here's what they told me. In my life, I've been harmed. I've been harmed by people who purported to care about me, and I've been harmed by people who really did care about me. And when that happened, I didn't need the people who hurt me to make nice. I didn't need a showy apology. I didn't need to be asked for forgiveness. And I really didn't need to be rewounded by explaining again and again what was wrong with what happened. I needed them to be quiet. I needed them to take a seat and give me some space, and not to leave, not forever, not to fire themselves from my life, but I needed them to take some time just to observe passively and ask no questions. I needed them to take a deep look at themselves and process what they were discovering with someone else who could help them. I needed them to educate themselves on the cycles of abuse that had caused them to behave harmfully and prioritize healing the part of themselves that kept perpetuating it. And then I needed them to demonstrate to me, consistently and over time, that they can treat me better. So when I'm part of a harmful dynamic, either one I was born into, like white supremacy, or one that I behaved my way into, like selfish relationship practices, I have to turn those expectations around onto myself. And so for the past 2 years, I've mostly been in the hush yourself and learn through explore the inner wounding that compels you, stages of confronting racism. I don't care who you are, at some point, you are going to find yourself in the process of needing to make amends. And not just in small relationships. We're all in this big intersectional mess of a web, and there are elements of the dominant culture that we either internalize or externalize. This is natural. It's inevitable. This is what Bell Hooks talks about with everyone needing to heal from patriarchy. It's something that those of us in the United States who are not Indigenous need to hold every single day, that this land remains inaccessible to the tribes disenfranchised from it. It's in the times that cisgender people discriminate against trans people without even knowing it. It's in the ways that society creates disability out of difference by failing to account for non-standard needs. And this is not a guilt trip. It's a truth of human existence. By being human, we are guaranteed to hurt each other. If we deny that, we throw away any chance we have at making it right. One place where many people start to learn about accountability processes is in 12-step groups like Alcoholics Anonymous. Like pretty much everything out there, 12-step can be helpful or unhelpful depending on your own circumstances. But for me personally, Eating Disorders Anonymous really changed my life in my early 20s, when I was in crisis and there were no other resources for someone like me with no hope and no money. The notorious 12 steps, while by no means the entirety of the recovery approach, provide a memorable framework for unstucking your life, which is focused less on your problematic behaviors and more on the root causes behind them. And the 12 steps provide us with another opportunity to ask ourselves where else these ideas might apply to our own value systems, whether our goal is to save a marriage, build a healthy community, create global justice and equity, or maybe just to stop self-sabotaging. As you've likely heard, step 1 is admitting you have a problem. If we want to apply that to my story from earlier, this is the part where I admit to myself that racism exists in me. Each of the other steps also provides great material for exploration, but I'm not preaching about those today. I'm preaching about willingness. So let's fast forward to step 8. Verbatim, step 8 reads, made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. Ah, you might think, this is the part where we apologize, which is an understandable mistake, but there's some key wording in that step, so let's listen again. Made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. Making lists is the easy part of this step. The real work of step 8 is about willingness, finding the willingness to make amends. Why bother with this clause at all? Why not finish your list and then go on to step 9? If you know that making amends is right, shouldn't you do it anyway, whether you are willing or not? Well, I'll ask you another question. How many of you who grew up being told you had to finish your boiled broccoli before leaving the table, no matter how much you disliked it, grew up to be particularly excited about broccoli as a food? If you do like it, how long did it take you to learn to enjoy it? How would it have been different if you had been allowed to discover it and acquire the taste for yourself? There is actual science behind this method, by the way, which shows a lower incidence of developing an eating disorder or any other fraught relationship with food if children are allowed to lead their own discovery and acclimation process to new flavors. It actually makes a lot of sense that step 8 would be cognizant of this, and you could argue that it's the heart of 12-step recovery. When we do things because we should, rather than because we are willing, the byproduct of that discipline is resentment. And in 12-step recovery, resentment is pretty much the core driver for addiction. It's an intolerable emotion, and making amends before you're willing is a recipe for relapse. By no means am I saying that we should never do anything that we don't want to do. There are always things that we have to do for those around us but don't want to. Consideration and compromise are indispensable in interpersonal relationships, and most of the time, this means doing things that we don't want to do. But if you want to learn how to take those adverse actions without drowning in an ever-expanding pile of resentment, the in-between step is to become willing. When you just do what you're supposed to do, that doesn't create an active connection. You're checking boxes, you're following lists. It's a mechanical form of ethics, which neglects the fundamental complexity of human interaction. People and their needs are constantly changing, constantly shifting, and in order to stay flexible and aware, our goodness has to come from the heart. I am willing. I don't want to be objectively right, to be beyond reproach. I do. I absolutely want to be perfect and irreproachable, but it's not actually helpful, and it doesn't make me or anyone else happier when I try. When we're in a place of willingness, we want to do what's best in this moment for both of us. We're concerned about everyone's present and future well-being, and less concerned about defending ourselves or guaranteeing a comfortable future. We stop trying to prove that we're a good person, and we start acting like a good person. So my charge to you, dear congregation, whatever the future brings to this church after today, is to stop worrying about what you're supposed to do. Start doing what you're willing to do. And if you're asked to do better, or you find yourself faced with an important but undesirable call, or you need to make amends, or you want to get involved with anti-oppression, or, I'll repeat, if and when you are being asked to behave differently by someone in this community, stop. Get quiet. Look inward. Get curious. Find out where your willingness is being hindered and why. And then become willing. And back your actions with your whole heart. All other love is empty. Become willing. It will give life to this community. And I'll commit to you, when we meet again, I'll be doing the same.